Here are the slides. Is that all working? Can you all see the slides okay? Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. So psychedelic moral enhancement, a virtues-based integrative account. This is not going to be anything remotely resembling a tight argument. Rather, it's going to be a sort of sketch of a research program that hasn't yet been undertaken, and it is based on collaborative work with my friend and colleague, Associate Professor Nin Kirkham, who's also in philosophy here at UWA, the University of Western Australia. So if you ask me any difficult questions that I can't answer, my excuse is going to be that that's Nin's part of the project. So I do actually have an epigraph to start off. I'm not going to read it out, mostly because I don't know how to pronounce the French phrase, but I'll just let you have a look at it for a moment. So Nin and I both thought this was, oh, there you go. It's Iris Murdoch. I didn't realize you didn't have the attribution up yet. Nin and I both thought this was a very nice kind of encapsulation of the themes of this new project of ours. And all the photos you'll see on the slides are actually taken by us, by myself and Nin. And these are photos of the landscape here in Western Australia. And I think there are some of Nin's garden and stuff like that. And again, there are reasons, there are thematic reasons why this is appropriate, apart from knowing that we have the copyright. So the talk is going to be in three parts, but the basic research question that Nin and I want to address in our new project concerns psychedelic moral enhancement. So the proposed use of psychedelics, classic psychedelics, which I'll define shortly, as agents of moral enhancement, agents to kind of improve people's moral character or moral behavior. And we want to look at this specifically through the lens of virtue theory. And so this is where Nin's big contribution comes in. I bring the psychedelics, she brings the virtues. And in previous work, we have argued that certain kinds of psychedelic experiences undergone in certain circumstances do have the capacity to catalyze or promote the development of a particular subclass of virtues, namely the environmental virtues, which Nin has written about before. And our new project aims to sort of broaden and deepen that idea. So we want to ask, might psychedelic experiences have the capacity to catalyze the development of a broader range of virtues, not just the environmental virtues, and also possibly vices, right? So we want to broaden it in that sense, but we also want to deepen it in the sense that our prior work on psychedelics and environmental virtues didn't really go into the mechanisms in too much detail. And we think this is a very interesting topic in its own right, as well as being kind of crucial to coming up with a convincing account of what this whole phenomenon is and how it might work and how it could potentially be used and optimized. So three parts to the talk, and for some reason my computer is not working. As if I click, okay, I'll just have to use the, oh, now it's caught up. I've got a Bluetooth mouse and keyboard and they sometimes lag a bit. In fact, yeah, the keyboard seems to be lagging quite badly at the moment, which is unfortunate timing. Okay, I can do it down here with the mouse. All right, so three parts to the talk. In part one, I'm just going to give an overview of psychedelics, psychedelic experiences, and environmental virtues. So summarize the sort of previous work that Nin and I have done on this topic. In part two, I'm going to mention some questions that are still outstanding that haven't really been answered fully or satisfactorily by our existing work. And then in part three, I'm going to outline what we think is a promising path to kind of come up with a comprehensive, multi-level, interdisciplinary account of this phenomenon of psychedelic moral enhancement, and that's combining virtue theory, the kind of conceptual framework of virtue ethics, with the concept of integration. And we think there are actually three distinct senses in which the concept of integration could prove important. And so I'll unpack those a bit. So starting from the start, psychedelic experiences and environmental virtues. So the basic idea in our earlier work was, in Nin's terms, an arranged marriage between psychedelic moral enhancement and environmental virtue ethics. So there is this sort of burgeoning literature on psychedelic moral enhancement, kind of some empirical evidence and quite a few theoretical proposals that psychedelic experiences undergone in safe, controlled conditions might have the capacity to improve people's moral cognition and moral behavior. There are certainly plentiful anecdotal reports of people becoming more altruistic, selfless, generous, all kinds of good things after a kind of high dose transformative psychedelic experience. And in particular, there is this kind of ongoing connection, this sort of link between psychedelic use and environmental ethics, and the idea that psychedelic experience, with its kind of frequent features of unity and interconnectedness, could promote more positive relationships to the natural world. And so Nin has previously written about this idea of environmental virtues, the idea that there are specific kind of character traits and cognitive dispositions and so on that relate distinctively to our interactions with the natural world. And so we thought it was a very obvious move to combine these two and to say, well, if psychedelic experiences really can do this, really can kind of make people feel more connected to nature in a durable way that kind of transforms their affect and cognition and behavior and so on, then this could perhaps illuminatingly be characterized as catalyzing the development of environmental virtues. And in particular, Nin has written about an environmental virtue that she calls living in place, which kind of incorporates elements of wonder and awe and humility and respect for nature and things like this. So that's sort of everything I've just been saying. I'm getting ahead of myself. But there were three considerations feeding into this. I don't know why this is all coming up in the wrong order, by the way, but there you go. So we thought, first of all, there clearly is a need to develop a variety of different responses to the environmental challenges that humanity faces at the moment. Obviously, we're not claiming that sort of personal level solutions like, you know, cultivating environmental virtues or one's own environmental ethics are a substitute for systemic and political solutions, but we think that, you know, it's clearly a good idea to develop you know, multi-pronged approach and have as many different tools in our arsenal as we can for intervening at all sorts of different levels of scale. So there's this kind of idea that we need ways to change our behavior towards the environment individually, collectively, and fast. Then there is this growing body of research. It's still quite small, but it is growing, showing that psychedelic experiences of certain kinds can be transformative, can kind of have lasting effects on people's cognition and psychological processes and behavior. And when it comes to this business of moral enhancement, we think that the most compelling evidence so far actually concerns this domain of environmental ethics. A lot of the other stuff, you know, interpersonal relationships and so on, is still relatively speculative and anecdotal and so on, but there is a growing body of, you know, serious quantitative evidence linking psychedelic experiences to pro-environmental behavior. And then, of course, there's this conceptual theoretical work in philosophy done by Nin and various others, articulating and defending the notion of environmental virtue ethics. So I'm not going to say very much about one, the idea that we need kind of ways to change our behavior towards the environment, but I will give you, to the best of my ability, a bit of background on psychedelic research, what psychedelics are and their effects and so on, and then environmental virtue ethics. And that's the bit where I'm going to be really in Nin's territory. So I'll sort of do my best to kind of give you some understanding of that. So I'm using the term psychedelic here in a fairly common sense nowadays in the scientific literature. It's a narrow sense that refers to a neuropharmacologically defined class of drugs that are sometimes known as classic psychedelics or serotonergic hallucinogens. These are psychoactive substances that alter consciousness quite dramatically, mainly by an agonist action at the 5-HT2A or serotonin 2A receptor in the brain. So the most famous examples are LSD, psilocybin from magic mushrooms, mescaline from various cacti, and DMT and N-dimethyltryptamine, which is found in various plants and animals. There are lots of other members of this class, but the class doesn't include some other drugs that sometimes get called psychedelic. So if you think about things like MDMA or ecstasy, ketamine, salvia divinorum, these all have substantial phenomenological similarities with classic psychedelics, but there are differences too, and crucially, there's a different neuropharmacological mechanism. So I'm not talking about those purely the classic psychedelics. So classic psychedelics have a very long history of human use in various indigenous cultures, religious, medicinal, spiritual, ceremonial use going back at least hundreds, but quite probably thousands of years. There has been some scientific interest over the years. There was a bit of a wave of interest in mescaline in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then there was a big kind of spate of interest in the 1950s and 60s. That all came to a sort of crushing halt for various reasons, some better than others. And then there wasn't much human research for a couple of decades. There were still animal studies, but really no research into the effects of classic psychedelics on humans happened in the 1970s or 1980s, with one or two small exceptions. But since the early 90s, there's been this revival of scientific research into the effects of psychedelics on humans, and it's now reached the point where it's being referred to as the psychedelic renaissance and being sort of hailed as the new, next big thing in psychiatry and neuroscience. And I think the most important finding from this new wave of research to emphasize is that classic psychedelics are actually quite safe. Of course, they're not perfectly safe, nothing is, but there's a large amount of evidence now that when you kind of screen and prepare people adequately and apply rigorous exclusion criteria and all this sort of stuff, they can be given with a very, very favorable safety profile in controlled sort of clinical conditions. And physiologically, they don't cause dependence. There are some minor risks if people have problems with their heart or blood pressure or whatever. Psychologically, the risks, of course, have to do with phenomena such as, psychosis, some kind of psychosis or lasting psychosis-like state, or kind of what's called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Not very well understood, but a phenomenon in which kind of there are lasting perceptual changes after psychedelic experience. But the prevalence of these things in kind of controlled clinical settings seems to be extremely low. I mean, there was a paper 8 years ago now, actually in 2016, which reported over 2,000 doses of psilocybin had been administered to both healthy volunteers and to people with various psychiatric diagnoses, anxiety, depression, various forms of addiction, without any documented cases of psychosis or HPPD. So there are risks, but it looks like they can be managed very, very well. And so a lot of the interest has to do with the apparently transformative effects that psychedelic experiences can sometimes have. Now, psychedelic experiences are highly variable, far more so than those of other drugs. They're heavily influenced by what's known as set and setting, so the psychological state of the person taking the drug and the environment in which they take it. But when you have people taking a moderate to high dose, especially a high dose in the kind of setting that you see here, so lying down in a calm, quiet room, sort of eye shades, listening to classical music, having a very inward-looking, introspective experience. A high proportion, in some studies, as many as 2/3 of people have a so-called mystical type experience, which is a type of experience featuring distinctive phenomenological characteristics, first and foremost a sense of unity or oneness, but also a sense of noetic quality, a sense of gaining sort of genuine deep insight into the fundamental nature of reality, feelings of transcending time and space, and so on. And across a lot of trials, there is evidence that it's this type of experience that predicts the sort of lasting benefits of psychedelic experience that people are excited about. So it's the psychometric ratings from standardized questionnaires operationalizing this concept of a mystical type experience that have proven to be the most reliable predictor of lasting decreases in depression, anxiety, addiction, and lasting increases in things like well-being and mindfulness and so on in healthy volunteers. And of course, there's a potential link to ethical behavior there because these mindfulness capacities in their sort of traditional cultivation in Buddhism and so on are held to be importantly related to the ability to act ethically. So there is this idea of psychedelic moral enhancement. Of course, most of the excitement about psychedelics in the last 10 or 15 years is focused on therapeutic applications, but a lot of people are also very keen on this idea that they could be used for the betterment of well people, in a phrase that comes from Bob Jesse. And there are all these kind of very compelling anecdotal reports of people saying, after my psychedelic induced mystical experience, I became a different person. I was completely transformed and I was more patient and generous and selfless and things like that. And it's not necessarily just people blowing their own horn. In some studies, we do have kind of reports from community observers, spouses and siblings and family members and loved ones saying, yes, they did become a nicer person after their psychedelic trip. But if we look for quantitative evidence, the strongest evidence so far concerns one specific domain of moral behavior, and that's environmental behavior. So it's very common in the mystical type experience and even in sort of sub-mystical psychedelic experiences for people to report a very strong, vivid, visceral feeling of connectedness, being increasingly connected to their own senses, their own body, other people, the natural world, and so on. And even in clinical trials that take place in sort of relatively sterile indoor environments with not much deliberate attention to nature, you still get people reporting this spontaneous emergence of feelings of connectedness to the natural world. So this quotation here is from someone who underwent psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression, and they say, "Before the psilocybin experience, I enjoyed nature. Now I feel part of it. Before, I was looking at it as a thing, like TV or a painting. But you're part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it." And so this is obviously the sort of thing that one might readily assent to sort of intellectually or reflectively, but it seems that to experience it in the vivid kind of way that people do can be quite striking and potentially transformative. So we have a quantitative finding from that study of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression of significant increases in the construct of nature relatedness after psilocybin. We've got another study finding that lifetime use of psychedelics, but not other drugs, correlates with nature relatedness. This is a purely correlational study, but they did also quiz people about, their psychedelic experiences and their experiences on other drugs. And it turned out that the degree of nature relatedness didn't just correlate with their lifetime use of psychedelics, but also with the extent to which they had undergone the experience of so-called ego dissolution during their most intense psychedelic experience. So the kind of disintegration or, absolute kind of cessation of the phenomenal sense of self. Then we've got a prospective survey study. You survey people who are going to have a psychedelic experience before they do and then again after. And the finding here was very similar. You've got nature relatedness significantly increasing for 2 years after a single experience. And then this increase correlates with two things, both the extent of ego dissolution, again, during the experience, and also the perceived influence of natural surroundings. So how much the person felt that natural surroundings influenced the nature and content of their psychedelic experience. Another study here sort of showing lifetime psychedelic experience correlating not just with feelings of nature relatedness, but also with environmental behaviors. Now, of course, these are self-reported, there are methodological limitations, but again, there are interesting statistical models showing that this relationship between psychedelic use and pro-environmental behaviors is statistically explained by the degree to which participants identify their self with nature. So there's a obvious kind of conceptual connection there to the idea of ego dissolution, the sort of felt disintegration of the phenomenal boundaries between oneself and the world allows for a greater feeling of actually kind of ontologically identifying with the natural world rather than just one's own body or organism. So this is what the authors say, results suggest that lifetime experience with psychedelics in particular, as opposed to other drugs, may indeed contribute to people's pro-environmental behavior by changing their self-construal in terms of an incorporation of the natural world, regardless of core personality traits or general propensity to consume mind-altering substances. So that's sort of a snapshot of the relevant psychedelic background. Now, what are virtues? Well, I don't really know, but I'm going to try and tell you. So a virtue, of course, it's a concept that goes back at least all the way to Aristotle. And so it's the idea of an excellent character trait, or more specifically, in Rosalind Hursthaus's words, a complex unity of dispositions to act and feel for certain sorts of reasons and to see and respond to things in certain sorts of ways. And so there's a kind of ought implies can principle here, right? So a virtue must be a way of seeing and responding to things and acting and feeling that is possible for us, given human psychology and our best understanding of human nature. It also has to be something that we could recognize a preliminary version of in our children and thus develop, expand upon, and correct as part of their moral education. And so against the backdrop of this broader conception of virtues, you've got the idea of environmental virtues as excellent character traits that relate specifically to our environmental rather than our social place in the world. So what are environmental virtues? Well, what I just said, character traits that relate to our environmental rather than our social place in the world. And there's a bit of a dispute, as I understand it, about whether there are distinctively environmental virtues or whether they are just good old-fashioned virtues of kind of, benevolence and generosity and things like this, just applied to the domain of the environment. And Nin's view, and I think possibly the view of Hursthaus and others as well, is that there are distinctively environmental virtues. They're not just old virtues applied in a new domain. And so the most commonly attested, or the most widely agreed upon candidates for these sorts of distinctively environmental virtues are respect for nature. So there's some of the people who kind of advocate that one. Awe and wonder, and environmental humility. And as I said, Nin has kind of coined this term living in place to refer to a sort of environmental meta virtue, or I think she calls it a master virtue, that is supposed to subsume all these things: respect for nature, awe and wonder, and environmental humility. And so you can probably already see the interdisciplinary potential of this sort of stuff, right? The sort of philosophical or theoretical claim that there is a master virtue that subsumes or incorporates these three seems to license the empirical prediction that these three will travel together and could be sort of studied as a sort of distinctive unified construct. And so just to kind of foreshadow where I'm going at the end, this is some of the stuff that we are starting to get involved in and would like to get more involved in, is actually kind of not just theorizing, but trying to operationalize some of these philosophical ideas, and so that you can have this sort of feedback loop between the philosophical theorizing and the empirical research. So there it is, Kirkham's living in place that subsumes the three of those. So the basic claim that we made in our paper, it's in Philosophical Psychology, and it's been out online for a couple of years now, but it's got its official volume and issue, and it's so officially been published this year, Kirkham and Letheby 2024. And so we say, if psychedelic experiences undergone by healthy subjects could produce more pro-environmental feelings and behaviors, as the emerging empirical evidence seems to suggest, then this in turn might have the potential to catalyze the development of environmental virtues. So kind of undergoing this experience of the dissolution of ego boundaries and this sense of kind of profound unity or connectedness or even identity with the natural world could leave a lasting impression and kind of dramatically alter people so that they exemplify environmental virtues like living in place to a greater extent than they previously did. So psychedelics, we think, maybe, possibly, tentatively, we want to say, can promote living in place. Sounds good, right? Well, it sounds good, but it's not the end of the story. It turns out there are still quite a few outstanding questions. And so that's why we're not just stopping at this one paper, and we're sort of currently working out the outlines of a whole new research program to, as I said, broaden and deepen these ideas. So, outstanding questions. Well, first of all, does it really work, right? There's a bit of evidence, but it's small scale, it's preliminary, and we're quite clear about this in the paper. We say, look, we think the evidence that we survey and the interpretation of it that we give warrants kind of tentative or cautious acceptance of our hypothesis that psychedelics can promote living in place, but more evidence is needed. And of course, for that evidence to be gathered, there is methodological, conceptual work to be done. We need to figure out how exactly to study things like living in place, and if we can operationalize them, we need to replicate these existing findings, or someone does, in larger samples. And so we're currently involved in an attempt to replicate some of these findings. I can't say too much about it, but we're also, as part of that project, trying to come up with a way to operationalize environmental virtues like living in place. And we're sort of drawing some inspiration here from some recent interdisciplinary work in philosophy and psychology on the operationalization of virtue theoretic constructs. And this is one reason why we think that, you know, virtue theory is a very good fit for studying this sort of stuff, because there is this precedent now, and it's the sort of thing that lends itself very well to operationalization using kind of standard psychometric methods. So Marco Meyer and co have developed this epistemic vice scale and shown some very interesting findings with it, that it predicts, I think they found that the level of epistemic vice predicted acceptance of COVID-19 misinformation or something like this. And so there's a really kind of useful paradigm there of how to actually take virtue theoretic constructs or concepts from the philosophical domain of virtue theory and translate them into kind of empirical hypotheses. But, you know, the landscape is becoming a bit complicated, as it always seems to with psychedelics. There was a recent study of psilocybin and nature relatedness that reported a null finding, no effect of a psychedelic experience on nature relatedness. And so why is that? Well, it could be that there's no real effect there and that, you know, all the earlier findings were spurious, or it could be to do with the sheer complexity, the variability of psychedelic experience, the influence of set and setting, and the fact that to get really transformative effects reliably, I mean, I think there are some cases, rare cases, in which a person simply has a psychedelic experience and that catalyzes most of the transformative work itself. But I think in most cases, the psychedelic experience creates a window of opportunity that needs to be harnessed in various ways if kind of real and serious lasting change is going to occur. So this is another question that Nin and I think is worth investigating. That's a really lovely view actually from our campus at UWA across the Swan River to Kings Park and the Perth CBD skyline. So just a bit of an advertisement for this incredible place where we work. But yeah, another question is, look, supposing that it does sometimes work, and I have to say I find these early findings pretty convincing. The fact that you've got all these sort of theoretically significant and predictable correlations between things like ego dissolution and the effects of natural surroundings and changes in nature relatedness and so on suggests to me that there's some kind of real phenomenon there. But it certainly doesn't always work, right? It's absolutely not the case that all psychedelic use leads to the development of virtues. I mean, that goes without saying. Clearly, lots of psychedelic experience, psychedelic use and psychedelic experience either doesn't change people very much at all or changes them for the worse. So diminution of virtues, development of vices, I think definitely can happen as a result of psychedelic use, and sometimes nothing very much happens. And so a really important question is, what are the determinants, right? If there are psychedelic experiences that lead to or that catalyze virtue cultivation and many others that don't, it just raises this really basic question, you know, what are the mechanisms and what are the determinants along many, many dimensions? So substance, dose, setting, preparation, what happens afterwards, who's there, all this kind of stuff. So as I've said, the psychedelic experience is known to be quite susceptible to set and setting, and there's also this idea that has been, you know, widely accepted for a long time in the psychedelic world, but has only recently started to be studied rigorously, that integration of the experience afterwards is important for lasting change, for lasting therapeutic and transformative effects. And so that's kind of a bit of a preview of one of the roles that we think the concept of integration might play. Is one of our kind of hypotheses is that integration is one of the crucial determinants, right? So you can have a psychedelic experience of your bodily boundaries or your ego boundaries dissolving and identifying with nature, but whether that really leads to the cultivation of environmental virtues or indeed any other virtues is going to depend crucially on what you do afterwards and whether and how you manage to integrate the insights from that experience into your kind of thinking and emoting and behaving. So that's the question. What factors maximize the probability of virtue cultivation or virtue acquisition after a psychedelic experience? And then the related but distinct question, how does it work? There's some autumn leaves on the UWA campus. I took that one. I'm quite proud of it. So if we want to know when it works and when it doesn't, the obvious question to ask is, how does it work, right? And so if we could understand the mechanisms, then hopefully that could help us to optimize this, to work out how to do it really effectively and really efficiently. And the attempt to answer these two questions is going to interact reciprocally. So hypotheses about the mechanisms involved are going to yield predictions about what factors will correlate with good outcomes, and then findings about what factors correlate with good outcomes are going to fuel the development of mechanistic hypotheses. So yeah, and the most influential hypothesis so far about how psychedelic experiences can function as moral enhancement agents, or how psychedelics can, is what I'll call the unselfing hypothesis. So this term unselfing comes originally from Iris Murdoch. The Finnish philosopher Juuso Kahonen and I both independently hit on the idea that it's a really nice concept to use to analyze psychedelic experience. And so Nin and I, in our paper that's just come out, sketched the following possible mechanism. Psychedelic-induced ego dissolution leads to a very intense and salient experience of feeling identified with nature, right? Identified with in a very strong kind of ontological sense, feeling as though one's self doesn't literally, end at the boundaries of the body, but actually includes the natural world on which one is clearly dependent and with which one is, quite plausibly continuous in some strong sense. And then we sort of piggybacked on the idea that's out there in the psychedelic literature that psychedelic therapy and psychedelic transformation functions as a kind of inverse PTSD, right? So it relies on the idea that, look, PTSD is a proof of concept that a single emotionally salient, intense, overwhelming experience can have lasting, profound effects on one's affective and cognitive and even perceptual processing. And of course, in the case of PTSD, the experience is negatively valenced and the effects are deleterious. But some people say, look, the basic abstract way to understand what's going on in psychedelic therapy is it's the positive instance of the same phenomenon, right? It's kind of people having a discrete, intense, overwhelming, and highly salient experience that is extremely positively valenced. And you do actually get in a lot of these studies, something like 2/3 of participants saying this was in the top 5 most meaningful experiences, personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of my life. So it's clearly something that is, making a profound impression on people, and that then the salience of the experience leads the person afterwards to keep revisiting it in a way that sort of doesn't necessarily require much deliberate effort, but it can involve deliberate effort. And then that sort of serves to have this rewiring kind of effect on one's, attentional tendencies and values and all this kind of stuff that shapes our experience of the world. So, you have this salient experience, you revisit it repeatedly, and then this durably changes how you represent the relations of the self to nature, both ontological and affective, and then also that's going to change one's patterns of attention, one's patterns of motivation and value, and of course one's behavioral dispositions. So as I said, Juuso Kahonen has created a very similar model of psychedelic moral enhancement more broadly. He's not just looking at kind of nature relatedness and environmental ethics, but he also sort of advocates and develops in more detail than we do the sort of unselfing hypothesis of psychedelic moral enhancement. We think it's very promising, but as it stands, it does have some limitations, both our version and Juuso's. So for one thing, it's only a sketch. Even Yuso's development of it that is more detailed than ours is still just a sort of sketch. So we need to work out in more detail, particularly the sort of interlevel mechanistic relations. So how events and processes at the level of receptor pharmacology relate to changes in sort of local neural circuits and then regional brain activity, large-scale resting state networks like the default mode and salience networks, the computational and representational processes in these, and then how those sorts of processes relate to what's going on at the level of phenomenology, conscious experience, moral behavior, and so on. So that would be really the ultimate goal of this sort of inquiry, is a detailed multi-level mechanistic account of psychedelic moral enhancement that could kind of fill out the unselfing idea. It's also not clear, although Yuso does have some ideas about this, but more could be said about how it could translate to changes other than environmental virtues. The environmental story is quite easy to tell in unselfing terms because you have this dissolution of perceived ego boundaries, and that allows you to identify with the natural world, but it's clearly not going to work exactly like that necessarily in the case of other virtues or other kind of morally relevant psychological factors. And the other thing is, everyone in the psychedelic world focuses on the sense of self and changes to the sense of self. And I've been guilty of this myself, to coin a phrase, but there's a lot more that goes on in psychedelic experience than just changes to the sense of self, right? So there are ideations, there are apparent kind of philosophical, metaphysical, existential, and indeed axiological insights. There are changes to perception, most famously in the visual modality, but in others too. There are changes to attention, which of course could plausibly be linked to the sense of self, but there are also visionary experiences, metaphorical experiences. I mean, just to pull one sort of case off the top of my head, in a study of psilocybin assisted treatment for nicotine dependence, one participant described having this experience of seeing a vine. I think she had a vision of sort of the place down the side of her house where she used to go and smoke. And she sort of saw, herself from the outside as this kind of huddled, sort of miserable person smoking. But then she saw this vine that sort of grew up the side of the building that, did really existed, but she was just having a visionary kind of, hallucinatory experience of it, and then had this sense that, oh, that vine is me, right? I'm not this kind of miserable, huddled little person sort of inhaling this nicotine. I'm this strong, green, kind of growing thing that is, made of life and positivity. And there's obviously stuff going on there to do with the sense of self and the self model, but the metaphorical processes are really, really interesting. And it's clearly not something that can just be neatly subsumed under the unselfing hypothesis in its present form. So that's another limitation, is it seems like there's more going on than just changes to the sense of self. And there's also changes to the sense of self that don't fit into the sort of simple version of the unselfing model. Further questions then. Is unselfing really a core mechanism? If so, might it work for other kinds of changes than cultivation of environmental virtues, and how might it work? If so, how does it work in detail? So what are the connections, explanatory, kind of constitutive, ontological, between processes and phenomena at different levels of explanation, levels of organization, timescales, and so on? And finally, what's the role of these other factors that are not readily assimilated to unselfing? So perceptual changes, ideations, metaphorical visions, and so on. And the final question is methodological or epistemological, which is how can we find out the answers to all the questions I've just outlined? Do we mainly need more empirical research, more clinical trials, more survey studies, more armchair philosophy, some combination? I mean, big surprise, spoiler alert, we're going to say we need all of the above. But in the final and very short part of the talk, I'm going to sketch our current sort of thinking in relation to the question, what is a promising methodology for developing, or at least trying to develop, an empirically plausible, conceptually coherent, philosophically sophisticated, virtue theoretic account of psychedelic moral enhancement? So it's all got to do with virtues and integration is the answer. So we're nearly there. Why virtues, right? Why pick virtue theory in particular? Well, it seems to us that it's very well suited to the nature and structure of psychedelic moral enhancement as it's understood so far. So basically you have this kind of phenomenon whereby people undergo a salient experience, and then, as I said, seemingly by revisiting that experience or the things that they believe they learned from that experience, they gradually undergo these changes in their kind of attentional and affective and perceptual and behavioral dispositions. And so understanding these sorts of complex changes to behavior and multiple psychological factors seems to dovetail very nicely with the way virtues are analyzed within philosophy. And why integration? Well, as I said, we think that not just the concept of virtues, but also the concept of integration is going to be important for coming up with a convincing account of psychedelic moral enhancement. And there are three senses in which we mean the term integration. So first of all, we want integration between different disciplines and different levels of explanation. So we want to pursue the sort of paradigm of a multi-level explanation of a phenomenon that, as I say, spans all the way from molecular pharmacology to conscious experience and, interpersonal and ethical behavior. And so obviously integration is a key idea there if we're really going to come up with a comprehensive, deep and complete account of what's going on in this phenomenon. So we want to do the sort of work that, people like, well, lots of people do this sort of stuff these days. I don't really need to introduce the idea at a conference like this, but the people whose work I'm a really big fan of off the top of my head are my longtime collaborator, Phil Gerrans at Adelaide, who works on delusions and other psychiatric phenomena, and Thomas Metzinger, who's done a lot of work on self-representation, the sense of self. And to my mind, their work and the work of a lot of others provides a really good paradigm of how to come up with the sort of convincing philosophical account of some psychological or cognitive phenomenon that really does synthesize and integrate evidence and theory across disciplines and levels and so on. So the second sense of integration is this post-session integration period. As I say, it's virtually a truism in the psychedelic world that is now starting to be tested rigorously for the first time, that integration of a psychedelic experience afterwards makes all the difference to lasting therapeutic and transformative effects. And we definitely think that's plausible when it comes to virtue cultivation. So in clinical trials, typically there are sessions, meetings with the therapist explicitly scheduled after the psychedelic experience and devoted to this process of integration. So recalling the experience, unpacking it, trying to make sense and meaning out of it, and trying to come up with concrete plans for how to actually embody and learn to kind of live in accordance with what one believes to have been the important or legitimate or valuable insights from the experience. So Houston Smith, the eminent religious scholar and psychedelic research volunteer, has this lovely phrase in relation to mystical experiences, psychedelic and otherwise, and how they relate to spiritual practice and the spiritual path more broadly. He talks about turning flashes of illumination into abiding light. And so we would love to pursue this idea and ask, given the right sort of experience, the experience of unselfing, ego dissolution, sort of positive feelings of wonder and awe and connectedness, what needs to happen afterwards? And so then we're kind of, we're using integration in this sense, this distinct sense in which it's used in psychedelic research, but it's also in a way extending integration in the previous sense. And so we're looking not just synchronically, but also diachronically, and starting to try and understand the nature of a very extended and extremely complex causal process that, starts with stimulation of the serotonin 2A receptor and then includes not just changes to cognitive processing and neural computation, but also interpersonal interactions and so on, that seem to be not just where the effects are manifested, but actually a key part of the process itself. So it's a very big, complex, interesting thing to get our teeth into. And we think that anthropology could be really interesting here, because there are all these traditions, indigenous traditions. There are the ayahuasca religions that use psychedelic beverages ceremonially in South and Central America, and all of these kind of traditions seem to have very well developed and very effective frameworks precisely for turning flashes of illumination into abiding light. They have very sophisticated psychedelic integration protocols. And so Nin and I think it would be very interesting to sort of not just confine ourselves to neuroscience and developmental psychology and so on, but also to bring in anthropology to try and get some insights into how the kind of set and setting dimensions and the sort of institutional and interpersonal aspects of this integration process might work. And of course, there is evidence starting to come out about that now from the clinical research world too. So cognitive neuroscience models of personality change, the so-called afterglow period, where after a psychedelic experience, people often feel kind of uplifted and unburdened and, energetic and exuberant and optimistic for a period of anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months. And often enough, it just ends there, right? In some cases, you have changes that can be shown to last for, years. And so we want to look at these emerging models, kind of linking, trying to get some more clarity about, what exactly connects the afterglow period to more lasting change and that sort of thing. And so the third and final sense of integration is the most specific and substantive one, I suppose. So I've asked, what might be important to putative psychedelic facilitated virtue cultivation besides mere unselfing and identifying with nature? And one idea is that it actually has to do with increased integration between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. So many problems, especially many moral problems and problems of living, have this kind of basic structure in which we believe some proposition intellectually, we assent to it sort of reflectively, but somehow we don't feel it and therefore we don't act on it. And so the most common cliched example of this is our own mortality. Of course, we all know we're going to die, but arguably most of the time it's very difficult for us to actually seriously grasp the reality or the meaning of that. And when we do, in those rare moments of experience, we find ourselves having a completely altered sense of priorities and thinking, wow, I really need to change how I'm acting and how I'm comporting myself, maybe change my career, change what I'm devoting my life to, change my relationships or how I'm behaving in them. And so it seems like there is often this sort of disintegration between thought, affect, and behavior that can have morally pernicious effects. That, that stems from somehow our inability to feel the truth of the things that we believe intellectually. And so there is this suggestion that Yuso Kohonen has made, and that Samir Chopra and I have also made in another chapter, that psychedelic moral enhancement might work at least partly by fostering increased integration, right? And so there is neuroimaging evidence that in fact you get greater functional connectivity between normally disparate brain networks under psychedelics. And it's all stuff that, you have to be very careful about over interpreting, but you do see intriguing and suggestive findings of kind of increased connectivity between sort of prefrontal regions and limbic regions and stuff like this. That is really what you would expect to see based on the phenomenology, where people are talking about, really feeling and experientially grasping the truth of things that previously for them were mere dry intellectual beliefs. And that seems like the sort of thing that could plausibly even subsume the unselfing hypothesis, because you get people saying, oh, well, previously I believed that I was connected to nature, but then I really felt it in this experience. So you get that sort of increased integration between thought and affect, and then consequently behavior dynamic in the sort of unselfing environmental ethics case. But then you get it in lots of other cases as well. And the type of case that Samir and I talked about, this is actually our chapter in the Letheby and Gerrans book, so second promo for that. We're talking about forgiveness experiences, so cases where people come to really feel that they've forgiven someone who they thought had wronged them in a psychedelic experience. And it tends to have this structure that they sort of intellectually had forgiven them, but not emotionally, or they thought they had forgiven the person, but then in the psychedelic experience, they realize they hadn't really. And then they get this genuine, full-blooded, emotional forgiveness that kind of feels quite cathartic and leaves a sense of unburdenedness and peace and so on in its wake. So is it true? Right. So far, again, it's just a sketchy kind of hypothesis that fits well with the evidence so far. But we need more evidence. We need to operationalize it. We need to kind of theoretically work out how it relates to the unselfing mechanism, where changes to attention and salience attribution fit into the picture. So basically, we've got a lot of work to do. So wish us luck with the grant application. And that's the end. Thanks.